It's a great pleasure to be here, to be able to talk to all of you and to provide you with my views on the history or genealogy and varieties of just transition. I will try to keep my presentation to about 40 minutes, and hopefully we'll have a question and answer or discussion afterwards. A brief outline of the presentation. I have a few slides that provide some context and goals of the presentation. And then I discuss what I call the explicit just green transitions. I provide a history of it, and I will explain what I mean by explicit in two parts: the rise and decline of just green transitions in the United States and the globalization and proliferation of just green transitions around the world. In the second part, I will discuss what are just transitions needed for. Are they needed for all transitions or just green or energy transitions? And we'll close the discussion of the variety of just transitions in terms of their ambition based on an analytical scheme that they develop elsewhere and in one of the readings that I have suggested. And then I have some closing comments. So let me provide a bit of the context of this presentation. Just transitions aim to make all transitions equitable and humane for all affected workers and communities and people. This presentation focuses on just green transitions because they are prominent and because they indirectly engage nature and society, which is of great interest to me. I approach just transitions not solely as particular policies, specific policies, but also, or rather, as elements of the political economy that they advance. And this is something that I want to underscore because a great deal of the discussion of just transitions deals with them as isolated specific policies. My goal in this presentation is to ground just transitions in history and to offer ways to differentiate amongst them, not to explain the politics behind them. That is another project. So let's talk about explicit just green transitions. Provide a history. Why explicit? Labor environmentalism, the rise and decline of just transition in the USA, the globalization of just transition, the proliferation of just transition. I will discuss all those in seriatim, one after the other. And the main points I would like to leave you with is that explicit just transition is the product of labor environmentalism. It is a product of labor environmentalism. In short, it challenges the view that work and environment, or unions in the environment, or workers in the environment are intrinsically at odds. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind because just transition has become so popular that it is possible to lose sight of that and to think that the concept of just transition did not arise until it was included in the preamble of the Paris Accord in 2015. Now, having said that, explicit just transition has been contested within labor and now within the broader society. So I'm not saying that labor environmentalism represents all of labor. There are many unions, many workers, many communities that are not happy with labor environmentalism or with just transition, and that continues to be the case to our days. So why explicit? Explicit refers to the origins and actual use of the term just transition, the specific term just transition in the USA. Implicit, on the other hand, refers to transition policies that are just and humane, even though they do not use a term. And there are many of those. These kinds of implicit just transition policies can be specific economic or social development policies that really pay attention to justice and equity and trying to be humane to people as well as cognizant of nature. But more importantly, this kind of implicit just transitions can be either specific policies or embedded in broader eco-social welfare politics. And if we look at the politics of eco-social welfare, they go back a couple of hundred years. So a great deal of what we think of as the social welfare state, or increasingly the eco-social welfare state, includes the kinds of provisions about healthcare, retraining, pensions, relocation that we associate with just transition policies. So it is important to note that the explicit just transition approach that emerged in the United States was amongst the first generation of union and environmentalist proposals that directly called for the abandonment of environmentally damaging production activities. That's very important. It's really momentous. The fact that workers and labor unions in the United States, in Great Britain, in Brazil, and elsewhere in the world, going back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, actually called for the cessation of particular production activities in which they were employed. It is really difficult to imagine anybody, states, corporations, civil society organizations, communities, saying that what we're doing is really part of the problem. It's actually the problem. And it is important that we stop doing so. So you can imagine how profound it was for a number of union activists, of labor environmentalists, in the same sense like human rights activists or gender environmentalists or indigenous activists, saying, what is happening, what we are doing, what we are participating in is the problem. And the solution is for us to stop doing what we are doing. Now, let's connect labor environmentalism and just transition. The just transition strategy is one manifestation of labor environmentalism. And labor environmentalism refers to the environmental proposals and practices of labor unions. They have a long history. In many ways, they can be taken back to the 19th century and earlier. If you in the history of occupational health and safety, for instance. So labor environmentalism has a longer and broader history than just transition. I'm going to talk about labor environmentalism more. I'd be glad to discuss my views on that. Just transition is a particular thread within labor environmentalism, responds to job blackmail by capital, business, saying that if you do not accept certain kinds of if you demand certain kinds of environmental rules and practices, same thing could be said about social or labor or other rules and practices, we're going to relocate, we're going to leave, and you're going to lose all those jobs. It's very powerful and continues to, is part and parcel of the structural power of capital. It also, just transition responds to the fear of transition by affected workers and communities, which is aggravated by job blackmail. If you have been doing something yourself for your whole life, and your parents and grandparents have been doing the same thing, you have built a community or live in a community that's articulated around it, whether it's a mine or a supermarket or some other kind of a long-term activity, a school or a hospital, it is really fearful. It is really challenging to think that what you're used to will not exist 1, 2, or 5 years down the road. That happens quite frequently, of course, all the time. Governments and corporations and abandon particular activities, they close down mines, they close down schools, they close down manufacturing facilities and leave workers and communities behind. But the idea that somebody will say, we are going to engage in a just transition. We are going to decide that 1 or 2 or 5 years down the road, what we're doing will not exist anymore, but it's going to happen in an equitable, fair, participatory way. Even so, that is really a demanding challenge. So the third reason that just transition has emerged is because of the environmental commitments of labor environmentalists, but also the labor commitments of other social movements. Let's talk about the origins of explicit just transition in the USA from the 60s to the 70s. Its roots are in US labor environmentalism. In the United States, a number of labor unions in the 1960s were leaders in environmental politics. The United Automobile Workers, for instance, organized the first National Water Conference, and they were strong supporters of the first Earth Day. There was emerging what we can call social environmentalism, an environmentalism that fuses society and nature. And there was a great deal of writing and thinking and debating about that in the 50s and 60s, associated with very well-known, at least in the US, authors like Mary Bookchin, the radical social anarchist, and Barry Commoner, but also there were others. Also, occupational health and safety received additional impetus in the US during the 1960s and 70s. I want to be clear here. That doesn't mean that those kinds of issues were only addressed in the US. Other countries, in fact, and labor movements in other countries were far in advance of the United States. But I'm focusing on that because the term just transition was first used explicitly in the US. Another important development is the rise of environmental justice in the United States. A lot of people associate the rise of environmental justice with the 1980s and 1990s, with the rise of environmental racism. But labor unions were some labor unions, along with community organizations, were at the forefront of environmental justice and organized a conference on environmental and economic justice in 1976. And finally, in the 1970s, after the 20 or 30 years of the post-World War II era, where there was somewhat of a balance between labor, capital, and the state, that started falling apart. Neoliberalism started emerging, and along with neoliberalism and relocation, automation, and the closing down on plants, job blackmail became a very compelling argument. The two photos I have here, the first one is from a strike against Shell Oil that was joined by labor unions as well as environmentalists in 1972, and it's called the first environmental strike. And the other one is about Karen Silkwood, who was an activist in a nuclear plutonium plant and was basically assassinated. There's a great movie about that as well. So in the 1980s and 1990s, the concept of just transition started taking shape, and it took shape from a union, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. I mean, let's think about it. Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, doing some of the most toxic, dangerous, environmentally damaging things. A small union, which actually was based in Denver, Colorado, just an hour south of here. And a lot of that push towards changing and realizing that what those workers were doing was bad for the environment, but also bad for them. By the time they were 40 or 50 years old, that's not only in that particular sector, people, the workers were really damaged due to pollution, due to the kinds of things that they were handling. So behind this move was a man named Tony Mazzocchi. Tony Mazzocchi did not just appear out of the blue. He was part of the social environmental movement that I discussed earlier on, very much influenced by Barry Commoner and other people who in the 60s and 70s were talking about fusing nature and society, not just talking about nature, not just talking about wilderness, but fusing nature and society. So he was trying to find some kind of an approach to persuade first the members in his union and then society at large that it was desirable to transition out of those horribly damaging activities, chemical and atomic and oil activities. He used first the concept of the GI Bill for Workers, which was a bill after World War II to reintegrate veterans from World War II into the United States. He used the concept of the super fund for workers, speaking to a law in the US called the Superfund Law 1980 to clean up the earth, to clean up all kinds of polluted areas. And finally, the term just transition in its explicit form was used in 1995. Now, before I just indicate what did that first original call for just transition include, let me point this out, that the call for a just transition or a superfund for workers for this particular union and its allies was part of a broader policy agenda that included green industrial policy, universal health care, formation of a labor party, reorganization of the political economy and ecology, gender equality, and equality in general. It was part and parcel of a much broader, much more ambitious political agenda. That is, the concept of just transition did not emerge by itself, but it is emerged as part of a broader eco-social agenda in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s. You see the book by Les Leopold, who worked with Tony Mazzocchi for a long, long time and wrote a biography, and then Understanding the Conflict Between Jobs and the Environment, which was a document by the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. Let me just stop here for a second and make the case that other very, very important things were going around the world that are associated with labor environmentalism. Chico Mendes in Brazil had the same approach. And in the United Kingdom, the workers in the Lucas Combine, which used to produce weapons, try to shift the whole company in the direction of sustainable, renewable energy. And there are a number of other examples. So it is very important that you understand that I'm talking and I'm focusing on the United States, not because I think the United States and the United States unions were the vanguard of labor environmentalism, but just because the concept, the explicit concept of just transition emerged or was used in the United States, and I just want to provide you with that genealogy. So what were the components of the original just transition in 1995, keeping in mind that it was part of a broader policy? And this is verbatim. We propose that a special fund be established, a just transition fund, which we've called in the past a super fund for workers. Essentially, this fund will provide the following: full wages and benefits until the worker retires or until he or she finds a comparable job. 2, up to 4 years of tuition stipends to attend vocational schools or colleges, plus full income while in school. 3, post-educational stipends or subsidies if no jobs at comparable wages are available after graduation. And 4, relocation assistance. Many of those demands, in some form or the other, are still within the ongoing just transition policies. But if you take those 4 requests together, they are quite ambitious. In order to have, to allow for policies like that, a particular country, a particular society has to expand its social welfare society. It has to create a just transition fund that is comparable to retirement funds and to other kinds of social funding. So again, this ambitious proposal was embedded within the Democratic Socialists. This is what they would call themselves, program of the Labour Party that the oil, chemical, and atomic workers was working on creating during the 1990s. Doctor, if you want me to stop for a second, please let me know, okay? Now, at the same time that the oil, chemical, and atomic workers was promoting the idea of a just transition, environmental justice also was very ascending in the United States, certainly in the 1990s. But let me just put it in context. The origins of environmental justice are to be found back in the 1970s, not in the 1980s or 1990s. In the 1970s, there was an approach that was called eco-justice that really tried to fuse labor and the environment. During the 1970s, as I said, labor unions, some labor unions, brought together labor and environmental justice. But during the 1980s and 1990s, as environmental justice racism in the US arose, it became apparent and necessary for labor unions to establish connections. And as a result of that, the oil, chemical, and atomic workers helped create the Just Transition Alliance, which is still in existence, which still plays a very important role and has played a very important role in promoting just transition in the US. And during the late 1970s and early 2000, the oil, chemical, and atomic workers and the Just Transition Alliance collaborated on the ground in specific places where there was violation of labor rights, but also violation of environmental rights. The oil, chemical, and atomic workers union disappeared in 1999 and became part of another union, and eventually became part of what today is known as the United Steelworkers. What you see there is some of the historical leaders of the Just Transition Alliance. The man on the left with the glasses is the current executive director. The woman on the right with the glasses was the first executive director. Below is David Campbell, who is a steel worker in a actually he works in a refinery in Southern California and has been involved with just transition since the 1980s. And the person on the left is an indigenous person, a leader from Oklahoma. And those were all part of a webinar we organized a couple of years ago to talk about the history and the difficulties of collaboration between labor unions and environmental justice and indigenous activists in the 1990s and after. So the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, in addition to reaching out to environmental justice activists and environmental justice organizations, also try to persuade the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, which is the umbrella organization of labor unions in the United States, to engage in an effort to bring together workers and environmentalists. To that end, it created the Blue-Green Working Group from 1997 to 2001. The goal was to come up with a policy that included green transitions along with just transitions, but there was strong opposition by some unions in the USA and beyond to transition, and also others distanced themselves from a just green transition. However, a number of them were very much in favor of green transition, and they continue to be so, but they find the idea of a just green transition to be a little bit too problematic for their members and for the country as a whole. And soon thereafter, in 2000, 2001, the just transition declined in the USA and Canada, where it was also very popular. The person on the left is Jane Perkins, who led this Blue-Green Working Group and was the first woman executive director of Friends of the Earth in the United States, and also a unionist. And in a story that she conveyed to me, the last meeting that was planned to bring together environmentalists and labor unions who were sort of in a serious tension situation was scheduled for September 11th, 2001. And of course, that was the day where there were attacks on various parts of the United States. And she watched as the meeting was called off. And that was the end of that particular effort. However, and let me just briefly discuss this table. However, by this particular point in time, it is possible to identify 4 possible configurations in terms of the green and just transitions. In some cases, some unions and some environmentalists and some, certainly a lot of businesses and a lot of governments felt that there is an inexorable conflict between jobs and the environment, and that just transition is absolutely unnecessary. Others felt that there is jobs versus the environment with just transition is possible. They still felt that there is some conflict between jobs and the environment, or employment in the environment, but perhaps a just transition would solve it. Those are very few, and they are more reactive to events. There are those, and I'm going to move to the right, that believe that jobs in the environment without just transition are very possible, and we have that in the United States. So we have something called the Blue-Green Alliance, which is a long-standing alliance of environmentalists and labor unions, and we have it throughout the world. Quite frequently, you will hear that if we take care to create a lot of green jobs, a lot of environmental employment, everybody who needs a job will get a job. We don't need the just transition, which can be controversial. And finally, the 4th combination is jobs and environment with just transition, which is what the oil, chemical, and atomic workers want to do, and what labor unions around the world have tried to do over the last 20 years. So let me move to the next part then, the globalization of labor environmentalism from 2000 to 2008. Labor environmentalism, as I want to repeat, did not start in 2000. In order to build something, you need to work, you need to prepare. It started a long, long time ago. But in the early 2000s, you have a number of national unions that started playing a very important role in terms of labor. Central to that were the Comisiones Obreras in Spain. And on the left, you see Joaquín Nieto, who was one of the leaders of Comisiones Obreras and was the Secretary for the Environment. The trade union confederation in England, United Kingdom, also played a very important role. The Australians early on. An important development was the creation of sustained labor. Sustained labor was created by the Comisiones Obreras in collaboration with the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions and UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, and I don't remember who else. And it was a labor non-governmental organization whose goal was to basically spread labor environmentalism in the world of labor and around the world, not only in the industrial world, but around the world. During their existence from 2004 to 2016, they tried to carry that out. They operated throughout the world. They had seminars. They brought together unionists from various parts of the globe to create a global labor environmentalism. One of the most important points in that effort was the Trade Union Assembly on Labor and the Environment that took place in Nairobi in 2006 and brought together labor environmentalists from throughout the world. There was another one in 2012 in Argentina. It's very important to note here that the role of Comisiones Obreras was very important, but also that increasingly labor unionists from places like Argentina and other South Africa and other parts of the world became engaged. So there was a lot of foundational work to make labor environmentalism global. Up to that time, during that period, I should say, the US unions were very skeptical of labor environmentalism and did not participate in the meetings on climate. But they finally rejoined in 2007, and there is a whole history behind what that happened, how that happened, which we can discuss in question and answer, but it did happen. And from 2007 and on, the International Trade Union Confederation and national unions made the connection of just transition and climate a priority. So in 2007, 2008, 2009, there was a strategic decision by the labor environmentalists within the International Trade Union Confederation and national unions to connect just transition and climate. Climate, of course, is very, very important, but the connection of just transition and climate, 2007, 2008, 2009, there were connections we did before that, but 2007, 2008, 2009, it became a strategic priority, leads some people to think that just transition is only about climate and energy transition, which is not the case. Some of the earliest just transition policies were about logging. Currently, some of the founders of just transition are calling for a just transition in healthcare, biodiversity is another issue, and on and on and on. On the right there, you see Annabella Rosenberg from Argentina, who was the environmental officer of the International Trade Union Confederation from 2006 to 2017, and collaborated very closely with Sustain Labor. At the same time that labor unions were pushing just transition in the meetings on climate, we start seeing the rise of climate justice. Brief timeline, the concept of climate justice started emerging in the 1990s in conjunction with corporate behavior. Climate Justice Now, a global network, was created in 2007. There was a grassroots Global Justice Alliance, Climate Justice Alliance in the US in 2012, and on and on. But around that time, there's a connection between climate justice and just transition in the early 2010s. A very interesting project in Australia that makes that connection 2007, 2008. But it's very important to highlight that it was not until about 2008 or 2009, or even perhaps a couple of years later, that climate justice activists came on board with the concept of just transition. Now, let's talk about the globalization of just transition from 2010 to 2015. During the Great Recession from 2008 to 2012, there was a variety of proposals on Green New Deals and all kinds of other deals to solve the problem. People saw the opportunity of the Great Recession as a way of kind of rethinking the economy, and they proposed a number of green economy proposals. Labor unions did include just transition, but practically every other Green New Deal proposal did not. Just to give you an idea, that 2010, 2011, 2012, most organizations outside of the world of labor had not come to terms or had not engaged the concept of just transition yet. The International Trade Union Confederation formally adopted just transition in its second World Congress in 2010. And increasingly more unions adopted just transition or engaged just transition, like the European Trade Union Confederation, the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas, South African unions kind of starts expanding beyond Europe and North America. Just transition, as a result of the efforts of unions, was put on the International Labor Organization's agenda in 2013, resulting in its guidelines for just transition for all in 2015, guidelines which reaffirmed and reworked at the last ILO conference in 2023. And finally, the term just transition found its way totally symbolically, without anything behind it, without any commitment, in the preamble of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And at that point, it really sort of was put on the global policy agenda, leading some people to think that basically it was the result of global organizations or broad civil society or something like that, forgetting the fact that it was grounded really for a long, long time in labor environmentalism. Since then, just transition has proliferated. I mean, I was trying to do a review just before in preparation for this presentation, and I was overwhelmed. More labor unions have adopted or engaged the concept. Many are opposed to it, or many are neutral. A number of environmentalists and other civil societies have also engaged the concept of just transition. Others are opposed to it or don't see much use to it. Some capital, like the B team that you see down there, has come up with just transition proposals and practices, and perhaps some corporations have, like Enel in Italy, have just transition policies. Philanthropy is big on just transitions. Global organizations and negotiations are dealing with just transitions. The European Union and various countries, there are subnational just transitions. But I want to restate, but there continues to be strong opposition, and there continue to be approaches that really would prefer to take out of just transition its more structural or ambitious vision. I participate in various meetings, in both advocacy and policy meetings, and quite frequently people say, perhaps we could use a different term rather than just. Just seems to upset some people. So if we're going to map just transitions to actually look at where we are in the present, that would be a great project. We can look at adopted policies, whether those are public or private. We can look at the geographic level, national, subnational, and we can look at their state of implementation. That's one category, adopted policies. Another category is policy formation. There's a lot of policy formation, public or private, at various geographic levels, and again, at various stages. There's even more policy consideration. Many governments, many corporations, many activist organizations engage and discuss the concept of just transition. But it's important for us to distinguish adopted policies from policy formation, from policy consideration, because otherwise we get the sense that every time we hear the term just transition, that entity behind it is actually applying it, and that's not necessarily the case. So if we leave out the territorial plans in response to the European Union's Just Transition Fund, which I will discuss shortly, the number of actual policies is rather limited. So let's go over in the next few slides of just transitions. Adopted just transition policies at the level of countries. Germany, 2018, and coal, but the German just transition or transition had started from the 1970s on. Spain in 2019, a very explicit just transition from coal. Spain also has a just transition ministry or institute within a ministry. Now, the territorial just transition plans within European countries in response to the European Union's just transition mechanism, many of them, just some examples. Now, let me just clarify what this is. The European Union in 2020 adopted what they call the just transition mechanism. Part of that is a just transition fund. And in order to be eligible for funds, the territories within the European Union that have been identified as in need of transition have to come up with a territorial just transition plan. If they come up with a territorial just transition plan, which is approved, etc., then they can ask for some of the funds of the just transition fund. So there are many, many territorial just transition plans, and the World Wildlife Fund, interestingly, has created a way to analyze them and rank them. But the point here is that many of the just transition policies in European countries are territorial just transition plans in response to the European just transition mechanism, and they deal with particularly coal communities. Canada, after a long period, finally adopted a just transition policy, but because of opposition, particularly from the province of Alberta, which has a lot of oil, they didn't use the term just transition in the policy. They called it sustainable jobs. New Zealand has a couple of regional just transition policies. They deal with particular regions. And one very important development, I was in a meeting just before this meeting, we now have the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. They were decided at the Glasgow meeting in 2026. No, sorry, in the 26th COP. And the idea is that the G7 would provide some monies to selected southern countries to help them transition. The first one to receive such monies was South Africa, and now Indonesia, Vietnam, and more recently, Senegal. In the discussion I participated this morning, basically, a lot of people feel that these are energy transition partnerships rather than just energy transition partnerships, and they have some other problems as well. There might be some other adopted policies that you can probably identify. Now, there are some adopted just transition policies subnationally. Here in Colorado, where I live, we have a formal just transition policy from coal that was adopted in 2019 and is actually being implemented. Scotland has been discussing a just transition from oil and gas. I'm not sure they have a comprehensive just transition policy yet, but they have a number of other policies that are just transition policies. They have created a couple of commissions that are really have done incredibly interesting work. Here in the United States, Illinois, the state of Illinois has a just transition from various forms of energy, 2021, but not from nuclear energy. There are, as I said, territorial just transition plans within European countries and various local policies, such as in Latrobe Valley in Australia, Huntley coal plant in upstate New York, Diablo Canyon nuclear plant in California, and probably other local just transition policies. This is not a comprehensive list. There are some international just transition policies adopted. The one that I mentioned is the European Union's just transition mechanism. The Just Energy Transition Partnerships are another very important development. The World Bank has a just transition from coal policy, and the International Labour Organization, in addition to advocacy, also has programs for capacity building in some countries of the Global South. Now, policy formation. The countries that have been for a long time discussing formation of policy, just transition policy. South Africa, very interesting case, goes back a long time. Trinidad and Tobago from oil. Ireland, other countries involved in just energy transition partnerships. Now, around 50 countries have expressed interest according to an ILO document, and just transition has been mentioned in 65 out of 170 national determined contributions. These are reports that are submitted to UNFCCC by individual countries. So there's a lot of interest in just transition, a lot of discussion, but the actual adopted policies and the serious policy formations are still limited. There are a number of initiatives, that is efforts that involve significant amounts of resources, trying to lead the discussion of just transition in one way or the other. In the United States, we have the Just Transition Fund, which is a private philanthropic arrangement that does provide funds for grassroots organizations. The Climate Investment Funds, which is a global fund associated with international financial organizations, has engaged in a range of activities and deals primarily with the Global South, South Africa, India, the Americas. Recently, they had a project in Bolivia, for example. The International Labour Organization, in addition to building capacity, also promotes the concept of just transition, some of the regional banks in Asia and the Americas as well. There are also policy advocacy organizations with significant resources that have put those resources behind just transition. Again, from their perspective, that would include the World Resources Institute and the Environmental Defense Fund, and both of those organizations are what we may call liberal environmentalists. And there are now just transition centers, a couple of them in India, in South Africa, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. So is just transition still a global north strategy? There is nothing in my view that limits the strategy of just transition to the global north. Unjust transitions, systemically driven by uneven global divisions of labor, are also endemic in global south. However, until recently, explicit just transition proposals and policies came from the global north. Whether that is also true for implicit just transitions should be investigated, since a wide range of emancipatory, ecological, and social proposals have their roots in the global south. It's a great area of research. What kinds of implicit just transition policies activists and governments have proposed in the global south. Labor environmentalists were aware of the need to broaden labor environmentalism and just transition within labor, hence sustained labor and the 2007 Labor Assembly. Unions in South Africa and Argentina, but also the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas were early movers. The Trade Union Confederation of the Americas, which is the regional arm of the International Trade Union Confederation, in my view, has one of the more eco-social approaches to labor environmentalism and just transitions. It's worth reading their program. Currently, as this seminar suggests, there is a broader uptake of the strategy concept, and hopefully it will be fused with Southern ecological views rather than grafted onto them. Now, on the other hand, the just energy transition partnerships are globalizing just transition along the lines of historical global divisions of labor. So the transition, the transfer, the uptake of just transition by or in the global south is not in one direction. It can be in a more ambitious, emancipatory, socio-ecological direction, or it could be along the lines of existing uneven global divisions of labor. And I think JETPs fall in that, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. Now, I want to go into the second part and talk about just transitions. For what transitions? Transition refers to significant changes in the organization and operation of our immediate and larger political economy ecology. Transitions may be egalitarian or inegalitarian, ecological or unecological. Transitions and transitional policies are the products of public and private choices and contestations. They are not natural. They may be due to socio-technical changes, like AI or some other kind of advanced technology, but also to social and demographic changes, as people who have hitherto been marginalized are claiming their place in society. Here I focus on green transitions, but generally speaking, in my research, and my approach is one that says that we need a just transition for every transition. One question, are transitions from also transitions to? Many people are saying, well, my God, there are so many green jobs. They were, all those miners, all those people who depend on coal or oil and gas, they can start working for in the green, clean, new, whatever, renewable energy industry. The important thing is that transitions may not affect and organize the same nature for people. Here I have a picture from Wyoming, which is just to the north of me, and another picture of offshore turbines offshore of the United Kingdom. So in order to fuse transitions from and align transitions from with transitions to, they have to be managed. But managed transitions like the JEPs are not necessarily just or ecological. The renewable energy industry, we need to keep in mind, is not a socialist industry. It's a capitalist industry. And there are very serious problems with its labor and environmental practices, supply chains, and many parts of South America are familiar with that, of course, whether it's lithium or other minerals in other parts of the world. So it's very, very important to not deify renewable energy. In order to have a transition from that becomes transition to, there has to be appropriate policies. There has to be a just transition. Another thing is that a lot of people and I've been reading studies for the last 15 years that saying the new green economy is going to create so many jobs. We don't have to worry. Nobody should be objecting to closing down the fossil fuel sectors. I'll give you an example from where I live again. Colorado is renowned for its thriving and expensive resorts. To your right, you can see Aspen, Colorado. I think in order to buy an acre of land there, you probably need $10 or $15 million. I haven't tried, so I don't know. All of these towns used to be mining towns, mostly precious and industrial minerals. As mining declined, miners and related workers left and were replaced by expensive resorts and poor survey workers. And some of those resorts are owned by Mexican investors. The transition was from one set of people to another, not a transition of the particular people displaced. The particular people displaced, as these towns move into a new kind of economy, those people were basically sacrificed. At the end of the day, they could hardly afford to own their houses because taxes, land taxes, which are very important in the US, went up. The other thing is and this is something, again, very important. I don't know how many of you know of Edward Wilson. He wrote a very, very well-known ecobiologist who wrote a proposal called Half Earth. The idea is to reserve half of the Earth for biodiversity, for nature. The important question, of course, is which half of the Earth? And if one looks at maps, it tends to be a lot of spaces in Africa and South America and in parts of the global South. And the picture on the left is a kind of a poignant story. The bunch of Native Americans who used to live in a very well-known, very well-regarded park in the United States, the Rocky Mountain National Park. Those people were pushed out, and 15 years later, the people running the park said, wouldn't it be great for us to know what the Native Americans called various places in the park? So they invited a number of Native Americans to go around the park and tell them what they call the various places. I think it's a very sad and history that demonstrates the colonial nature of parks in the United States and throughout the world. And finally, we have to look at transitions in. We shouldn't just look at transitions in industries that are sunsetting, that are disappearing, or transitions to industries that are emerging like renewables. A lot of existing industries that are not going anywhere are going to change as a result of automation, as a result of moving to renewable energy, whether that's health or infrastructure or labor markets or various ways of production and consumption. And the primary example here in the United States now is the movement from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. And that's going to have an immense impact on communities and workers throughout the United States, to the point that the United Automobile Workers has said that they will not endorse President Biden for a second term unless he adopts a just transition for automobile workers as a result of his policies to electrify vehicles. That's very surprising. And the last part, in addition to varieties of transitions, there are varieties in the ambition of just transitions. From neoliberal transformative, I would go very quickly. The range, rather than typology, assumes that the ambition of a policy is related to its overall goals. In the case of just transitions, the goal is a more egalitarian eco-social world in which people and natures enjoy protections and rights, and in which the power of the powerful is diminished. You cannot have an egalitarian world if the power of the powerful is not diminished. Here we must keep in mind that uneven global division of labor may result in ambitious local or national transitions at the expense of people and natures in other parts of the value chain. We can have a great Green New Deal in the United States, not likely, but supposedly, but that can be at the expense of the rest of the world. Most current transitions seem to fall into the first two categories we discussed shortly. And I will close this short introduction. Just transition is now an essentially contested concept that does not make the term useless, but requires that we clarify how we operationalize it, as we would with democracy, efficiency, rights, and so on. Do I have a little bit more time, or should I stop here?
I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think we have maybe 10 minutes and then we can have a
Oh, yeah.
space.
I'll be done in 5 minutes, right? Let me just
Okay.
very quickly go through the different types, typology or varieties of just transition.
Okay.
Starting with neoliberal just transitions, which provide opportunities rather than social entitlements, quite frequently associated with retraining, some retirement, limited to those that can take advantage of these opportunities, and just transitions that enable capitalism. In my empirical research, I can see those. I'm not going to mention any particular places or policies, but certainly the just energy transition proposals, partnerships would fall in that category. We can talk about managerial just transitions that focus on places and people to be contained or co-opted to avoid a crisis, targeted protections and benefits, just transitions as crisis or exigency management, just transitions that stabilize capitalism. On the right there, I have a picture of von Bismarck, Prince von Bismarck, who was the leader of Prussia or Germany in the late 19th century, who was so alarmed with socialists, at the time social democrats, that in an effort to basically take away their popularity, he established the first social welfare system in the world. So, but the idea was that to contain further change. We can talk about reformist and regulatory just transitions. They do enhance rights and protections for those affected. The goal is to socially regulate capital and the state to lessen social conflict over time, associated with social welfare economies. And there are reforms within the system, but not of the system. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to underestimate the impacts of genuine reforms. The fourth category is what I would call structural just transitions, which are reforms within the system that do not preclude changes of the system. In the United States, that would be Medicare for all, creating a socialized medical system that expands the domain of the public and limits the domain of the private. And finally, transformative just transitions. The term transformative is used so much nowadays, it is not clear what it stands for. So I prefer to just use it as one part of this continuum. It could be called egalitarian, social just transitions, not necessarily socialist. Include all affected across value chains, the democratic and egalitarian public sphere, which is not the same thing as statism. Just transition as part of eco-social fabric is a change of the system rather than within the system. In the minds of some people, the PLADA, the statement of the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas, leans the direction. Some of the work of the European Trade Union Institute, which is the research arm of the European Trade Union Confederation, has been discussing a great deal eco-social change in the last few years. And there are some unions that, in fact, I would say, and some environmentalists, of course, and some civil society organizations that do promote what may call transformative just transitions. But I don't think any of the actual policies we have are either structural or transformative. Closing comments. Just transition is the product of eco-social labor environmentalism. Its origins in the global north, but there is evidence of its globalization and proliferation into the global south. There it can be integrated to emancipatory ecological views that have long emerged across the global south. I'm empathetic and familiar with that. I have spent a lot of time in Bolivia, and I have witnessed some of the issues and the approaches that frequently are raised. But some strategies like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships can well deepen existing and uneven global divisions of labor. Just transition politics, in short, is not an insulated policy realm, but integral part of the politics of eco-social emancipation and therefore very seriously contested. Thank you.